It's kind of a given that how much a viewer enjoys a piece of art is going to depend on who they are. But I find it really interesting where there's some cases where it's really about how well you relate to the main character or how sympathetic you can be towards them more so than anything else. This is the case, I think, for Welcome to the NHK, a show that means a lot to certain people who find themselves in a position of relating to or being sympathetic towards the main character. But if you're not, if you don't like this main character, and how much you like them is probably going to depend on how much of your life has been like theirs, then it's a lot more difficult to enjoy the show. Like, if you don't respect these characters, or if you can't feel sympathy for the actions that they take, then you will probably hate Welcome to the NHK. And hell, it's possible that relating to it will make you hate it as well, because it does not remind you of very nice parts of yourself. And I think it's perfectly understandable to have no respect whatsoever for the main characters in this show. They are not painted in a particularly sympathetic light. The show asks you only to understand them, but not necessarily to take their actions as justified. So the main character in this series is Tatsuhiro Sato. He is a hikikomori, someone who never leaves his room and has crippling social anxiety and just doesn't want to be around anyone for any reason. He doesn't really know why this is. There's not really a good reason for it, but he has a million justifications in his own mind, and he's sort of devised a conspiracy theory that basically everything in the world is out to get him. Now, I've known plenty of people who loved this show because they related to it on the level of having social anxiety and having felt a lot of what Sato feels. There's definitely a sliding scale of some people relate to him somewhat, but have never been to the extremes that he goes to, and some people who have. Personally, I watched Welcome to the NHK in 2007 at a time when I was cripplingly socially anxious and was spending most of my time in my room. Granted, I was still in high school, so I didn't really have the option to completely bottle myself up in the way that Sato does. And mind, Sato has been closed up ever since after graduating high school. When he was going to college for his first day, he suddenly had this episode where he thought everyone was laughing at him. So he ran back home, locked himself up, and never left again. And I believe it's already been 4 years for him at the start of the series, so he's 22 probably. And the original novel was written by Tatsuhiko Takimoto after his own period of having been a hikikomori for 1 year. He sort of wrote the novel as a way of exploring his own feelings, trying to sort of explain them to the audience, and to wrap them in this light fictional trapping so that it would at least resemble a story, even though most of it is just a stream of consciousness in the mind of this character. Now, NHK, the novel, would be adapted into a manga and anime series, which would expand on the ideas of the story massively. They really changed it to be more of a story, to be less of just a guy in his room losing his fucking mind, which is what the original novel is. Takimoto was kind of hoping that writing this novel would help him with his situation. He was kind of trying to write his way out of it. And in the afterword of the book, written like a year after it's published, like for the second publication or whatever, he says it didn't work. It didn't really help. Like, he made money off of it and stuff, but it didn't really cure the problems that were at the heart of everything. And he basically spent years just living off of royalties from the book and not doing anything else. So it's a rough story, especially when you think of what happened to him as the real ending. Because Welcome to the NHK, I'm just going to spoil it right from the beginning. The book is very short, so if you just wanted to read through this, you could power through it in an afternoon. The anime series, again, expands on it a lot. I think that the ways that the anime series expands on it are entertaining, but not necessary to the overall point of the story. At the end, Sato manages to get a regular job. That's kind of his first step towards getting out of the situation. After he's gone through sort of a series of revelations, he finally finds some employment. But it's not just suddenly like sunshine and rainbows. It's not like it just fixes his life. It's not like he suddenly is able to deal with people. He just, he gets a blue-collar job because he has to, because he's basically being cut off by his parents, and he can no longer just live a sedentary hikikomori life. But the book ends with Sato being completely unsure about his future. Like, will I subsist this way? Will I fall into old habits? Like, is this actually going to help? And so when you think about the idea that the author himself tried to write himself out of being a hikikomori and failed, in spite of having a successful book, in spite of making enough money, all it really did was give him the ability to go back to that old life. You know, having the money now as opposed to relying on his parents meant that he could hole himself in on his own dime instead of on theirs. Not that he was relying on his parents' income when he wrote the book. I believe he'd already had a couple of other successful novels by this point. So when I saw NHK, obviously I related to it very deeply, and it quickly became my favorite anime. That's going to be a theme you'll hear in this podcast quite a bit, is that these are shows that I watched in my teen years. Most of them were one after another, quickly supplanting each other as my favorite anime, either because I hadn't seen as many shows at the time, or because I was going through this period of growth and sort of self-realization. Like, you know, all the time I was thinking about, like, who am I, and trying to sort of work through my identity. So when I saw these shows that sort of reaffirmed or had something to say about who I was or my lifestyle, then they very quickly became favorites. So I went from like Evangelion to Haruhi to NHK in the span of about a year. From there, I went on to like Eureka 7 and Gurren Lagann and F A Tale of Memories and Arjuna. I'm trying to think of what my next favorite was after that. It was just this constant cycle of like, you know, of finding new shows to be my number one favorite anime. So NHK was for a little while. And the most interesting thing about NHK for me, the most standout memory actually comes from after the show. Like, I'd watched it early 2007, but it was later in the year that I really started to connect with it on a deeper level, because I met this friend, a guy who we'll call Don-san, who was, in fact, a full-blown hikikomori at the time. Now, I'd first met this guy in a Japanese class in the year before, where we were both in Japanese 2 in the 10th grade, and I sat next to him at the back of the class, and he was very quiet, and I found out somehow that he was an anime fan. So I was trying to like talk to him about anime, but he was very reticent to talk about anything. He knew Japanese. Like, he was perfect at all these, everything we were doing in the class. I didn't know jack shit. So I was constantly trying to cheat off of him and get him to share answers with me, which again, he was reluctant to do. And then he disappeared one day. Never heard from him again. 11th grade starts, and he's in my Japanese class again, but at first I'm not sure it's the same guy, and he's not sitting next to me. It just so happens that he also sits at the same lunch table as me, because I sit in the back, and he would just always be sleeping at the lunch table. And I suspected it was the same guy, but I wasn't sure. So one day he comes in, and for whatever reason, he's at the lunch table reading a Lucky Star fan book. Some kind of Lucky Star related material that I assume he got for free as part of some kind of buying some Japanese crap. And so he's just reading it at the table, and I'm like, oh my god, Lucky Star. This is 2007, probably September or October. So Lucky Star has practically just finished airing, if even, and no one knew about it in the West. Like, this was not even a popular show relatively online, you know, unless you were in a very niche community. So I was shocked to see someone reading a Lucky Star book. So it so happens that we are both in the same study block right after lunch, which study block is a joke of a time period where basically at my school you had 45 minutes of lunch and then 45 minutes where you just sit in some classroom and you're supposed to, like, I guess, do homework or work on whatever. I just read manga. So he's in the same study block as me and sits right in front of me. So I start passing him notes, you know, asking about the thing, asking about what anime he's been watching and stuff, and I give him I either give him or ask him for his Yahoo Messenger address. Last day he ever comes to school. He drops out. The reason being that he had a condition called cluster headaches, where every single morning he would get a gigantic migraine that was like paralyzing, that would last like hours possibly. Made it so he couldn't come to school. So for the past like 4 years, he had been almost never able to actually make it to school, and he'd spent that whole time just holed up in his room watching countless anime and reading countless manga and playing countless visual novels, and he knew everything. This dude's seen way more anime than me, and that's saying something. You all know I've seen a lot of fucking anime. He's seen way more anime than me. So I start talking to him, we've quickly become friends, and the thing we really connected over was Welcome to the NHK, because we were both living that life. We were both these shut-ins who were socially anxious, who didn't want to talk to anybody, who had all kinds of problems, and all we cared about was anime. And it was really like the relationship between Sato and Yamazaki in the show. We weren't as at each other's throats about stuff, really, but he was this hardcore otaku shut-in, and I was sort of playing catch-up to him. Like, I was just getting into otaku stuff in much the way that Yamazaki kind of leads Sato down the anime rabbit hole, where Sato's not really an otaku at the start, but he kind of is adjacent to the culture. Yamazaki drags him in, and me and Dansan had that kind of relationship where he knew everything about anime and manga. I came over to his house for the first time. I think I rode my bike to his house, and he had like dakimakuras all lining the walls and stuff. I thought it was the coolest thing in the world. Still do. Still think it's the coolest thing in the world. He had all this anime crap, and mostly for the sake of having it. Like, a lot of it wasn't even for shows he particularly cared about. He just had lots of stuff just to have the otaku cave domicile, just as I do. We would talk a lot about NHK and about how we felt like we were in that exact scenario. And I remember him sending me, because he had the Puru Puru Purudin song that Yamazaki listens to obsessively. That was his ringtone at the time. So I had him send me that file, and I remember days where I would, just to sort of indulge in what I would just play that song on repeat all day. And this is, I think, kind of integral to why NHK is so resonant, is that a lot of it deals with this sort of indulgence. I think with otaku, there's this mindset of like, I'm already a failure at society, so let's go all in. Let's embrace it. Let's just say, if I can't be normal, then I'm gonna be the weirdest guy in the world. And that's where you get scenes like when Sato becomes like obsessed with lolly porn to the point that he's like taking pictures outside an elementary school before he realizes how fucked up he's gotten. I think that's a scene in the show. I don't remember if that's in the book. I could even be remembering a different series entirely and just crossing the threads in my mind, but I think that happens. Yeah, like, it's that mindset of like, the fact that I like lollies already means I'm a dame ningen, which Dame Ningen, does that play in the show? I think it does. That's a Kiniku Shoujo Tai song that plays in the show that goes Dame, 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 Dame Ningen, Dame Ningen, Ningen, which Dame Ningen means like failed human, is basically what it means. And of course they did the ending theme, which is Odoru Akachan Ningen. And I loved that song because it's sort of about diving into this twisted reality. Again, embracing this idea that if I'm gonna be fucked, I'll be the most fucked. And so with NHK, with me and Dansan, like, it was a show that I had first related to, but then later it became sort of a source of reaffirmation. It became a source of like explaining why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling. Why am I so socially out of touch? Why am I so fucked up in the head? Well, I can point at Sato and say, like, it's because I feel like that guy, and I can do the things that he does and sort of mire myself in this culture, this otaku stuff. It's not necessarily a healthy relationship, and I think that others can see the show as just a sad thing. Like, I know my good friend Best Guy Ever, he recently watched Welcome to the NHK and he was really into it. He considered it one of his favorite shows, a 10 out of 10. And I think it's because he completely understands and relates to the characters and how they feel. But he sees it as a step towards betterment, that you can use this show to teach yourself sort of what you're doing wrong and look at ways to fix it. And, in the end, it is sort of a hopeful message. It's like, even though the show simultaneously tells you this is no happy ending, you're not getting out of all of it, you're not just suddenly happy now, but there are steps you can take to improve. I think that's more what Nate takes from the story. Best Guy Ever, rather. What I take from the story, or what I took from it at the time, I mean, that's definitely something I saw in it. I did see it as something that was showing me a way out, but I also saw it as, I'm not out yet, so I'm just gonna do what they're doing in the midpoint of the story. Me and Dansan talking about, what if we tried to make our own eroge? like what Yamazaki and Sato try to do in the show. Of course, we never even made steps towards that. He could have probably programmed one, but neither of us could draw or do anything. So we'd sit on Messenger and talk all day about how fucked up we were, essentially. And that's really what I remember most about the show. And I know I rewatched it once around that time, but I haven't seen it in a long time. And I later picked up the light novel. And I think the light novel is the better version of the story insofar as it's more pure. Because the anime adds in all this stuff that does have interesting messages to it, and I'll get into some of that in a bit. But the novel feels real, where it does still have the whole plotline of Misaki who's trying to fix Sato, and that's totally fantastical. And there's almost a sensation in the novel that you're not supposed to take that story seriously. It's almost as though the book itself acknowledges that the only reason Misaki exists is so this is a saleable novel. The only reason she's there is because if you don't have a girl to put on the cover, you can't sell this book. If you don't have some semblance of a narrative, you can't just sell a story about a guy losing his mind in his room for a fucking 40,000 words. It just wouldn't be a story if not for Misaki, but she takes such a back seat in the novel, where there's a long part of the midsection where she almost isn't even brought up. And even the character of the senpai, who was the leader of a club that Sato was in high school, whom he lost his virginity to, in the novel, she only shows up once and briefly, just to explain how many fucking antidepressants she's on. It's like she meets up with Sato, and he is just kind of horrified to realize that in order for her to become a normalized member of society, she had to just medicate the shit out of herself, and that at the core she is still disturbed and depressed and fucked up. It's sort of presenting this as this is what Sato would have to do in order to live, and realizing that maybe even the normies are all fucked. We're all fucked. Nobody's okay. That's kind of the vibe you get from that scene, and that's the only appearance she makes. Again, the novel's very short, and it's a lot more brutal because in the novel Sato does a lot of drugs and drinks a lot. There's this stuff called the white powder that's referred to, where it's basically an off-brand cocaine that can be bought legally. And Sato does a lot of it, and this is how the whole NHK conspiracy thing comes about. Because in the anime, he just kind of randomly hallucinates all of his furniture talking to him, which is odd because even though Sato is presented as out of his mind, he's not presented as schizophrenic or anything. So it's odd that he has this episode, but in the book, it's because he's on drugs, and that's why he's hallucinating this stuff. And the conspiracy element is downplayed in the book as well. It's mostly about Sato just losing his shit in his room, wondering why the world is like this, doing lots of drugs. There's a part where him and Yamazaki get really fucked up on drugs and have a fist fight in the snow. It's the best scene in the book. It is so depravedly depressing. It's hardcore. The book it's a difficult read because it's just raw. It just hurts. And the manga and anime kind of turned it into more of a comedy. And I mean, the book is a dark comedy, but not in the sense that it's cracking jokes. It's a dark comedy in the sense that it's self-effacing, in that it finds the existence of this kind of person to be darkly humorous, but there's really nothing funny about it. It's only funny if you've been there and you also feel this way. If you have this sort of nihilistic mindset about it. I remember my friend Ghost Lightning read the book and he hated it, not because he thought it was badly written, but because he was just like, this is such a dismal view of a human, he couldn't feel sympathetic for Sato, and I don't blame him, because Sato's kind of a shitbag. He makes a lot of bad decisions, and he knows he's making them. He's completely self-aware about the fact that he's throwing everything away under the bus, and there's a line that we have to draw, all of us in society, where we have to decide when a person is accountable and when they're not. And it's a difficult line to draw because I don't think anybody's really accountable. We have to hold them accountable as a society. But the reason we act the way we do is because of who we are. It's how we were raised and what we came into this world with. we make the decisions we make because we were shaped to be this person. And I think that we have some illusion of free will of making decisions on a day-to-day basis, but we're making those decisions based on all the information that we have in our heads, which it's not our fault what information we do or don't have. People who make dumb, uninformed decisions, it's because they're uninformed. They don't know better. So when I look at Sato, even though he's making these decisions, he knows that these are not the right solutions, but the reason he's making these decisions is because of who he is. And who he is unfortunate. But we do have to hold him accountable because as a society, we have to at some point say, well, you're a destructive force. We can't just let a destructive force run rampant. It's a sad thought. It's all sad to think about. But that's the way that it is. And so in the anime series, Sato gets to go on a lot more sort of wacky, fun adventures. There's a lot more of him hanging out with other characters. He ends up dragged out of his house for a lot of the story. The early episodes are more the losing your mind in your room kind of thing, but then it really branches out and becomes about all these side plots and wacky new characters, which are pretty hit or miss. There are definitely scenes that work wonders though, and I'll talk about my favorite one, which comes in probably the worst arc of the show otherwise. Certainly the least animated one. Welcome to the NHK came out, I believe, either in 2006 or between 2005 and 2006. It was animated by Studio Gonzo, and very infamously, there were certain episodes that were just totally unfinished, barely animated, just ugly, off-model character art. The show's pretty inconsistent overall, but there's a few episodes that are just bad, and most of them come in this certain arc where Sato meets the old class president, I believe, of his high school, and she is embroiled in a pyramid scheme. The pyramid scheme storyline is pretty dumb and not that entertaining. But the more important part is that the reason she's embroiled in this is because her brother is also a hikikomori, and they live alone together, and he's trapped in his room. She's basically working for his sake, trying to raise money for him because he can't take care of himself. And there's this brilliant scene where Sato goes into his room and he gives a speech where he says, "I've read every self-help book. I know what all the answers are. I could write a self-help book myself, but none of that matters because it hasn't helped me. None of it's gotten me out of here." And what eventually does get him out of there is that his sister just abandons him. And after, I believe, 3 days of him just starving in his room because he doesn't have his sister to get him any food, he eventually just has to go. Like, he has to or he'll die. And we see a last scene of him having gotten a part-time job, and he's happier now because he escaped that life. And it really is like, man, sometimes you just gotta have the fucking floor fall out from under you to escape your own mind. I, for a long time, wanted it to happen to me. On some level, when I was in high school, there was a lot of time that I spent planning to run away. I would sit in bed thinking, I need to run away from home and just go out into the woods and scare myself. I need to become afraid for my life because I can't move this way. Nothing's changing. I've read all the self-help. I did the same thing. I read all the self-help. I read everything. I knew every single thing that you're supposed to do, and none of it worked. None of the positive thoughts, none of that shit was working. So I thought, I have to escape. I'm too safe. My family's taking too good care of me. I need to figure out how to become afraid. And of course, I was too much of a coward to actually do it. Eventually, I did break down and get my parents to take me to a psychologist, and I got medicated. And lucky for me, that actually helped because it doesn't help for a lot of people, but it did for me. And I've met other people who are in similar situations. It's actually funny. My friend Tommy Oliver, who runs the channel Rebel Pixels. The funniest thing about his channel is that a lot of it is self-help. A lot of it is self-help for artists, even though he remains incredibly depressed and having difficulty following his own advice. He is literally doing, like that character saying, I could write a self-help book. I've read so many. That's what Rebel Pixels is a guy writing a self-help book that he has not been able to completely follow. And I don't know what would save Tom. And that's the kind of dark recess that NHK kind of takes you to. And on the one hand, it's nice that the show is funny. It's nice that it can take that load off a little bit. It presents it all with a grain of sugar, a spoonful of sugar, to help let the medicine of how dark and sad life is go down. And it's not as though the show can't do the dark sad. It can. It has moments that are crushing, and it's helped a lot by a great soundtrack. The song Yokoso Hitoribochi is the most depressing song in the world. They somehow distilled loneliness down to a chord progression. Like, it is the guitars sound like your soul being ripped in half, and the vocals and lyrical content don't help. The Hitoribochi means all alone, and the chorus is just Hitoribochi. It's just a sad, lingering 6 minutes of fucking acoustic dread. I think the show does a good job in those scenes, and it can certainly capture those emotions, but because all that goofy stuff is there, I do think it takes away a little bit from the sheer real grit of the book. That feeling of just being there with Sato and like totally getting his mindset, and it feels real and it feels painful and harsh, and there's a fucking drugged up fist fight that is just, like watching the characters go through that is pretty rough. But then again, the anime series has stuff like where Sato gets addicted to Final Fantasy XI, and then Yamazaki catfishes him, and it's hilarious, and it is still a true story of this lifestyle. Like, it's not that these episodes are irrelevant. They still do involve sort of exploring the same ideas. It's still about the hikikomori life. So it's not that I think you should just throw out the anime series because the novel's better. I think they both deserve to exist and are interesting in their own ways. I just would encourage someone to indulge both. Like, there's a lot of people who've seen the anime who don't know about the novel. If you haven't read it, it's well worth reading. Both stories are worth having around. Even if the book's better, it doesn't mean the anime shouldn't exist. And besides, the anime has all this fantastic music, lots of fun scenes. So if I wanted to celebrate NHK for something, it's that it did kind of help me to give context to a difficult part of my life. I don't know if it made things better. I don't know if it made things easier, because if anything, it gave me an outlet to dive even deeper into my psychosis. It gave me something to look at and say, oh, that's what I am. I guess I can just embrace it. And I don't think that was healthy, at least not most of the time. Maybe I just got the wrong message out of the series. It's hard to even say because, again, the original author didn't even get the message out of the series that he was perhaps hoping to. He himself continued to be a hikikomori. And I don't think these tendencies are even completely gone from me. Just in the process of recording this, some of the things I said, I started comparing to what I'm like now, and I got a little bit concerned that I still am a reclusive hermit who spends most of my time in my room not forming human connections, even though I am successful. I wonder how much my current life is exactly like Tatsuhiko Takimoto. And like him, I also have an obsession with trying to explain and present the lifestyle of a guy trapped in his room. If you watch Digibro After Dark, you've probably seen plenty of it. Stuff like insomnia analysis. A lot of it is dedicated to exploring what psychosis is going on here. And not necessarily in a moral, like not in a way that necessarily presents an exit or says that this is good or bad. It's just, it is what it is. And maybe it's not healthy, but I don't know. It's a complex set of emotions. And I think it's totally understandable to look at Welcome to the NHK and say, Sato's a monster, no one should be like this. I agree. Doesn't make it any less true. Doesn't make it any less relatable, and doesn't make me, like, I can't look at Sato and go, even if I didn't completely relate to him, I couldn't look at him and say, like, oh, well, fuck that guy. Like, no, that guy has been me, and I maybe still have a lot of him in me. And I think that's about all I have to say about Welcome to the NHK for now. It's, again, been a long time since I last watched the show. I'm not entirely sure how I would connect to it today. I do think I've rewatched bits and pieces of it over the years, and it's a show that I don't think holds up as well as a piece of entertainment as it does as an idea. I think that the stuff I've talked about here is the most memorable stuff about the show, and it survives better as something to think about than it does as something to actively rewatch. Maybe that's part of why I think the novel is so much better, because the anime has a lot of scenes or moments or episodes that just feel rote and don't age as well as this core idea that the novel was just dedicated to exploring. But I would nonetheless recommend both. On the next episode of the Old Ass Anime Cast, I'm going to be talking about Boogie Pop and Others, which is a light novel that was dearly important to me in the mid-2000s. I'll be going through my history with it, and I'll kind of just be describing the plot because it's hard to actually find these light novels, and I don't expect everybody to go out of their way to read these, but I will be describing Boogie Pop and sort of running through the franchise and explaining my relationship with it. So look forward to that, and I'll see you then.